What's going on, guys? It's Alex here. So today I want to talk about something I get asked a lot about, and that is my grinder setup for knife making. This is a 4x36" belt grinder, or belt sander, I guess we'll call it. And these things are not made for knife making. These things have a lot of uses in knife making, but today we're going to talk specifically about grinding bevels, because I think that's what most people want to know is, why can't I use a 4x36 for grinding bevels in knife making? Why are these things not recommended? And honestly, I don't necessarily think that they're not recommended over the fact that I wouldn't necessarily buy one of these, a 4x36, specifically for knife making brand new. I think that there's better options out there for around the same price. But if you already have one of these things lying around your shop, or you can pick one of these up for really cheap, maybe 20 or 30 bucks on Craigslist or something like that, you can definitely make modifications to them and use them to make knives. You're not going to be pumping out a ton of knives with this thing. This is for your hobbyist knife maker, somebody who's just looking to maybe move up from doing it by hand. And I'll tell you one thing, this is a lot easier than grinding bevels by hand. Now, when it comes to using a 4x36 for grinding bevels, you're going to really run into two issues. The first issue is the platen, and the second issue is power. Now, all the modifications that I've done to this to kind of help solve one of those issues is completely proof of concept. I literally just used stuff that I had lying around my shop. None of this was meant to be permanent. It was just to see whether or not I could make it work without spending any money. And believe it or not, what I have set up here actually works pretty well, and you can get pretty decent results doing it this way. So let me show you real quick what I've done to this thing, specifically the platen area and why this is kind of an important thing to do, and then we'll talk about, I guess, the work rest and other things like that. All right, so the first thing is the platen. The platen area is this area right here. This entire grinding surface is the platen. Now, the problem with most 4x36s, I think all of them, as far as I could tell, is that the platen, or the grinding surface area, is significantly wider than the belt is. So I'll throw a belt on here. You can see how the belt, the belt is narrower than the platen is. And this causes a problem if you have a knife with plunge lines on it. So if you have a knife with plunge lines, you're not going to be able to tilt the knife to hit your bevel. You're not going to be able to get those plunge lines. This is kind of hard to visualize, and you almost need to kind of experiment and do it to see exactly what I'm talking about. Obviously, if this is here, or this the platen area sticks out farther than the belt does, how are you going to tilt the knife and get the clearance that you need to grind your bevel? It's just not there. Some of these you can adjust almost all the way over to one side. Like this one, I can adjust all the way over to this side, and I can kind of get a decent, I wouldn't say decent, but I can kind of get a plunge line on that side. But when I flip it over and do the other side, I end up running into clearance issues. So the best way that you can address this is to put another platen, or a secondary platen, on the grinder. Now, this is just a piece of scrap steel that I had kicking around on the floor of my shop for probably the past 5 years or something like that. It was originally a much longer piece. I just chopped the piece off that was slightly, I think it's a slightly wider. Now, it's about the same width as the belt, and that allows me to get an angle on my knife and give me clearance there, because I can adjust this belt all the way over to the exact corner of that secondary platen there. Now, I was originally just doing this as kind of a proof of concept, and I was going to go back and put a larger full coverage platen on here, but that kind of takes us into the second issue, which is the power issue. Now, when I have a belt on here, there's no contact between the belt and the original platen, which basically takes a lot of the friction away, and I think it helps the belt to kind of slide over everything easier. And I'm afraid if I put a larger secondary platen on here, it'll introduce a lot more friction into this whole setup and take a lot of the power away than I need. So power on these things is definitely going to be an issue, especially if you're talking about larger grinds like this on thicker steel. If you're sticking to smaller knives like these tiny little bushcraft knives, or even doing full flat grind knives like these, they're powerful enough for that. It's definitely easier than doing it by hand, I will say that much. It will take time though. Again, you're not going to be a production factory and grind a ton of knives using this thing. It's going to be for your hobbyist, someone who just wants an easier way than doing it by hand. These things are usually around, I think, 1/3 of a horsepower. At least the two that I have are. This is a third. I have another one of these that I use for surface grinding, and that's 1/3 horsepower also. Belt speed, they don't run at a super high belt speed, which, you know, that's kind of an issue as well. I suppose you could get a larger pulley and put a larger or smaller pulley on it and up the belt speed, but I think you're still going to run into power issues when doing that. All right, so let me show you the work rest here I got set up. So one of the problems that you're going to run into with, and I don't know if they're all like this, but I think they are, is that this work rest is going to tilt in the wrong direction. Now there's a couple of things. Let me get this piece off of here. This is how it was originally set up, originally came. It had this little nut on here, and you could adjust this, but it adjusted in the wrong direction. So what I ended up having to do is remove this little handled nut, wing nut thing, and obviously you can see that you can't adjust it in the opposite direction because there's nothing here. So I just took a piece of plywood, I drilled a hole in it, put it onto there, stuck a 1/4 inch bolt through it, and now I can adjust it in the opposite direction. And I can do a couple things. I can put a washer on here and screw this back on to keep it in place, or what I normally do is just take a clamp and clamp it down like that, and it's solid. It doesn't move once it's clamped down. And I can clamp this, or I can just put a little nut on here to the angle I need. A lot of times what happens is the angle is like right there, so I can't get a nut in here to kind of secure this down, so I'll just take one clamp and I'll just clamp everything together like that. And it's the wobble here is just from because I don't have this tightened down, but it's solid and it doesn't usually move. It ends up being pretty sturdy, and it actually works fairly well. You can get pretty decent results with this. Like I said, I ground this knife with it, and it actually turned out pretty good as far as I can tell. It could definitely probably be done better, but for using something like this, something pretty crude like this, I think it turned out okay. Now you may be asking yourself, why go to all the trouble of doing this whole thing, and why not just lock your work rest here at 90 degrees, and if you're using a bevel jig, just use an adjustable bevel jig, and you absolutely can do that, and there's nothing wrong with it. However, that kind of brings us into the issue of the work rest itself. This is just a piece of plywood that I bolted through the bottom, and I can adjust this up and down based on how many pieces of plywood I have on here, or I could even put shims under here or whatever to get the height that I need in order to match up to my little platen I attach. And if I was doing this permanently, that's exactly what I would do, is I would make this one nice big piece, thick piece of steel that actually overhangs a little bit on the sides, and that would allow me to use a much better bevel jig here, much better adjustable bevel jig, and I would just lock this down at 90 degrees and be done with it. However, I don't have a big piece of steel lying around, and I wanted to use stuff that I already had, so this is what I use. This is basically the only piece that I had lying around that will work for this, because you want a nice smooth surface. This is a nice piece of sanded plywood. If you don't have sanded plywood, you can just use regular plywood. You're just gonna have to sand it down nice and smooth, because you don't want a bunch of bumps on here, because the slightest little bump on a bevel jig like this will throw off your bevel, so not usually a good thing. That's the only reason that I chose to kind of make this little piece here and do the whole opposite angle adjustment thing. It works for me. It might not be for everybody, but for using stuff that I have around here, just kind of lying around, this works for now. And if you're going to do this on your grinder, you're going to have to get the spacing between this little platen here. If you decide to go with a tiny platen, a larger platen will give you slightly more room to work with, which is probably what I suggest. If you were going to get a piece of steel specifically for this, I'd suggest something a little bit larger. Maybe not the whole width, but definitely something larger than this one. Because you're going to have to get this adjustment right between the platen and the work rest. I'm just using some plywood to kind of get that distance correct. That way, when I I have my knife clamped here. It's right where I need it to go. Now my platen is just mounted to the back of the sander here via a couple of 1/4 20 screws. I just drilled and tapped 2 holes in the platen and used 2 screws and screwed it in from the back, and then sanded or ground off these screws, and that's it. I didn't do anything else to it. So that's pretty much the gist of how I attached it. It's very crude, but it does work, and if you already have one of these 4x36s lying around, it can definitely work for knife making. If you're a hobbyist, if you're looking at putting out a bunch of knives every week, this is not the option for you. You're going to want to get an actual knife grinder. But like I said, I made a lot of good knives with this, and it still works. So I think I'm going to continue using it. One issue that I have run into is, because this has just been used so much, is one of the bearings is starting to go out in one of these idler pulleys up here, which is something else I'll mention. These wheels up here, these idler pulleys, are exactly that. They're idler wheels or pulleys. They're not contact wheels, and what that means is they have a slight radius to them. Hopefully you can you'll be able to see this, but they are not flat. So when you're grinding anything using this idler wheel here, this idler pulley, it's not going to be flat. So you definitely have to keep that in mind if you're grinding, you know, your knife in this manner or whatever. You have to be really careful, because especially using thicker stock, because you can definitely grind this at an angle, and then you have to go back in and flatten it somehow. You have to hold your knife at a slight angle in order to grind it flat. So these are definitely not contact wheels, or they're not meant to grind on. People do, and it can work, but you just have to keep that in mind. So I do think that these are useful to have in a knife making shop. I actually know of at least one major custom knife manufacturer that has a bunch of 4x36s that they use specifically for handle shaping, and for handle shaping they're great. As long as you keep in mind that, you know, you have your top idler wheel. It's not necessarily a contact wheel, but it's an idler pulley, and it's not completely flat straight across. Other than that, they're great for shaping handles, and I will probably always have one in my shop for something. But I wouldn't buy one new. I would definitely look on the used market, check on Craigslist. At least in my area, there's half a dozen of these things floating around for 20 or 30 bucks. So definitely check used before you go out and spend $100 to $150 on a new one. So yeah, that's kind of the modifications that I made to this particular grinder, and it works okay. I'm going to stick with it for now. If I start pumping out a lot more knives, then I'm definitely going to have to upgrade. But for the hobbyist maker, I don't think you can go wrong purchasing one of these things. You can definitely modify it to grind bevels. You can use it for shaping handles. You can even use it for mild surface grinding if you want to. Hopefully this gave you some ideas and maybe some inspiration on how to modify your own 4x36 for knife making. So if you like this video, please like it. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.